In a sense, I guess all of us like to feel that we leave our mark behind us. We want to think about the things that we've done and the influence that we may have had on others. And we hope that it's going to be something very beneficial, something that will be recognizable, something maybe even that will endure. But we also know that that's not always the case. I know a lot of times the stories that we hear of people taking their family vacation, and they'll be traveling out west and they'll stop in some old west ghost town. And then they'll see the different buildings in the place, but they'll also be able to take a little trip out to Boot Hill. And they will see a lot of the markers there. Some of them will have pretty much standard information on them. But occasionally you'll see something that just has a one-time name. You'll see something Shorty or Slim, or maybe a bad character would be called Blackjack. Other times you're going to see the mound where there is a grave there and there's not a marker at all. Or if there is a marker, it might say something like unknown stranger shot dead in a gunfight and a date. And you see these particular graves and you wonder what kind of an influence those people had. What type of influence did they leave on the area around them? And as we look at those things, sometimes we think about ourselves and we say, I'm just so insignificant, there's just not that much to me here. I'm just worthless. And sometimes we feel that life as a whole is worthless. And we may think of things like that, but we also need to realize that there is part of God's plan involved in this. If we read in James, the 4th chapter, beginning in the 13th verse, James is writing, and he's talking about some who may feel that they are going to have some kind of an influence. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit." They're expecting to be able to go, and by their having been there, they will have some kind of an influence. But James continues on in the 14th verse, says, "Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." If we know the right thing to do and the influence that we're going to have because we have done the right thing, that's wonderful. On the other hand, if we know the right thing to do and we fail to do it, we've just put another black mark beside our name. And the influence that we may have had, the positive influence we may have had for some reason or another, all of a sudden is diminished. Even David had concerns about his life and the influence that he would have. In Psalms, the 39th chapter, verses 4 through 6, David writes and says, "Lord, make me to know my end, and what is the extent of my days. Let me know how transient I am. Behold, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my lifetime is nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere breath. Surely every man walks about as a phantom. Surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches and does not know who will gather them. David has a sincere thought here. When we look at the future and all of the things that we may have accumulated for ourselves, there's going to be some day that comes when someone has the responsibility of trying to decide what to do with all this leftover stuff. And we don't know when that is going to happen, because as he says, our life is just a breath. James said it's a vapor. And we know in cold mornings when we step outside and we breathe, we can see our breath, we can see the vapor. And it's there for a few seconds and then it vanishes. It's gone. And so we have to ask ourselves then, what are we going to be doing? Job says, remember that my life is but a breath. My eye will not again see good. He also recognizes how short life is. But when we look at Job, and we look at David, we look at some of the things that James wrote, the influence that they're trying to give us is to remember to make sure that you do the best that you can with the time that we have. Yeah, each of us gets 24 hours in a day, but what do we do with it? You know, and it doesn't matter if we are Skid Row bum down here. They've got 24 hours in a day. Or the richest person in the world. They got 24 hours in a day. What do we do with it? How do we use it in serving God or in reaching out to those around us and helping each other? Now, there are some people that we look at them and we have seen that they have been able to accomplish something. And a lot of times we'll take, and especially the famous people, we'll take an attempt to honor them. We may have a place where there are some statues that have been made for them, or paintings that we see. Some places, some people have been so significant that we think of the monuments that have been created, especially like the monuments that they have in Washington for some of our presidents. Or maybe even museums. A lot of the presidents have, in addition to having some kind of a monument, they also have museums where they have all their papers and, replicas of their office, and some of the clothes that they wore goes back to describe some of the houses that they started out in. And in particular, some of them have started from very humble beginnings and worked their way up and become president of the land. And they have been significant in our eyes. And so we'll have museums for them, or we'll name a school after them. And many of these people we're honoring because they have been able to touch lives. No telling how many lives, countless lives that they have touched and had a positive influence on. We also think about some of the others. We think about John Dillinger and some of the other criminal characters. They've had an influence on lives as well, but it hasn't been a positive influence. Now, what about most of us? Where are we? Well, generally speaking, we're standing somewhere in the middle. We'll reach out and we touch some lives. The influence that we have may reach a few, but it's not as significant as some of these big names. We know it's a lot more than Skid Row Bum over here, but we're still in kind of an in-between state. But just think, each of us here touches each other's lives. We have influence in the communities where we live, where we work. We come in contact with people, we have influence over their lives. What are they seeing in us? What should we be doing with our life? And are we using it properly in God's sight? Now, we need to follow Christ's example and the way that he lived a life of service and of humility. In John the 13th chapter, beginning in the 12th verse, John has been describing an account where Jesus has been washing the disciples' feet. Verse 12. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example, that you should also do as I did to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is the one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. These men have been following Christ for months now, for years. They've been watching him and seeing the things that he did, listening to the things that he taught. They have been benefiting by his influence. And yet here he is, the great teacher, and he has taken on the role of the lowest of the slaves. If you were a slave owner and you had several slaves, the one who got the quote-unquote honor of washing feet was the bottom one on the rung, the lowest of the low. And Jesus took that position in washing his disciples' feet. It doesn't matter how high we think we are. We can always have been lower. And we can also recognize our responsibility to serve when it's necessary, and not push it off and let somebody else do all the serving. Not let somebody else do all the work. I've got my share of it to do. Am I going to do it? And if we are sitting here thinking that we're so high on the totem pole that we're not going to have to make this type of a decision, we're not going to be put in that kind of a position, let's think back to Naaman and his servant. Naaman was the general over all the armies of Syria. But he had leprosy. And none of the doctors in Syria could cure him. But there was a little slave girl that said, if you go back over here to Israel, there's a prophet there that can cure you. And so Naaman comes. He comes to the king of Israel and says, I want to be cured of my leprosy. The king is expecting this to lead to war because, hey, I'm not a doctor. There's nothing I can do. There's no way I can cure leprosy. But then Naaman finds out he went to the wrong place. He needed to go to the prophet. In 2 Kings, the 5th chapter, beginning in the 8th verse, it happened when Elijah, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent word to the king saying, why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots and stood at the doorway of the house of Elijah. Elijah sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean. But Naaman was furious and went away and said, behold, I thought that he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not the Abana and the Parphar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. Then his servants came near and spoke to him and said, my father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. It doesn't always take great and wonderful things to do what is necessary. Sometimes it's the simple or the plain. But if it needs to be done, we need to do it. And we need to realize that we're not so great and wonderful that we are above doing something that insignificant. And we look at the things that God says for us to do. And we realize that maybe by doing those plain and simple things, when that's what needs doing, the influence we have will carry so much more. What about other Christians and the way that they served? When Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy, the 4th chapter, he was trying to guide Timothy through some of the things that was going to be happening in his life. Now, Timothy was still a young man at the time. At that time, society did not really feel young people had any common sense. You had to reach a certain age before you were even thought to know what was going on. Timothy wasn't there yet. But Paul writes him in 1 Timothy 4, verse 12, and says, let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, Show yourself an example of those who believe. Every one of us, if we have had the wisdom to know what to do, and we put the Lord on in baptism, we are to live as an example of what a Christian should be. And we look at the categories that Paul describes here, and notice that he puts an "and" with it, so that all of these are things we need to work on. The way that we speak, the way that we conduct ourselves, and how we love each other. And we're all family here, so we love each other. It's important for us. And our faith. The way that our faith works in us. And in purity. The way that we maintain ourselves unspotted from the things that Satan tries to throw at us. Show yourself an example of those who believe. And because he's writing to a young man, he says, don't let anyone look down on your youthfulness. It doesn't matter how young or how old we are. We still have that responsibility to be the example that we should. And Paul, who wrote this letter to Timothy, think about some of the things that Paul has done in his life and the influence that he had. Visualize, if you will, some of these maps that we've seen where it has the lines and it shows all of the different places Paul went on his journeys. And the number of years that we know that he was involved in doing these things. All of the towns that he went to. All of the people that he spoke with knew of his influence because he influenced them. But he also left a bit of influence for the readers of the letter in 1 Corinthians. The first verse of the 11th chapter in Corinthians, Paul writes and says, "Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ." Paul may not have walked with the disciples as Christ was doing his teaching. Paul may not have heard any, or if he did hear some, it wasn't very many, of the lessons that Jesus taught. But Jesus still had an influence over him. Jesus became an example for him. Just as he is encouraging the Corinthian readers and us today as we read this letter as well, to be imitators of Christ. Look at the things that Christ did and said. And for all of us, the way that we do this, as a prime example for parents, the way that we conduct ourselves in front of our children, we're influencing them. In Proverbs, the 22nd chapter, in the 6th verse, a verse that we use so frequently when it comes to our relationship as a parent guiding a child, it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it." If we teach children the right things, the right way, they're going to follow it. But in doing it and teaching them the right way, we've got to make sure that we are not overbearing or belligerent in the way that we're trying to instruct the children. In Ephesians, the 6th chapter, in the 4th verse, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." As we read through the Gospels and we look at Christ's life, we only find, to my memory at the moment, I only find one place where he actually shows anger. And that's when he clears the temple from all of the money changers and the vendors and everything that were selling in an area that was supposed to be reserved for worship of God. He says, get these things out of here. This is God's place. So as parents, we don't want to show anger. We don't want to have anger in the way that we deal with our children. We want to use logic at a level they are able to understand and guide them. Oh, one other thing let's think back about. Remember Naaman and his servants and the way that they worked for him, worked with him? So as the slaves were conducting themselves, or maybe we could put it in our situation today, as employees, as we conduct ourselves, how do we have an influence over those that we work with and those that we work for? Ephesians, the 6th chapter, verses 5 through 8. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. We conduct ourselves as if we are working for the Lord, and oh, by the way, we got this person as a supervisor over us. We are here to serve the Lord. And let's turn the situation around for a second. Let's say that we are the employer, we are the master, we're the supervisor. In Colossians, the 4th chapter and the 1st verse, Paul writes and says, Masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. Grant justice and fairness. Don't do special things for one or two employees because they're your favorites, and you leave others being pushed down or giving them extra work. Be fair. And if something happens, be just in the way that you deal with the situations. Don't take one person and give them 3 weeks suspension and the other person who has done the same thing and just spank them on the hand. Be fair. Be just. Ephesians, the 6th chapter and the 9th verse, Paul writes and says, And masters, do the same thing to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. When we think about the way that we are treating those who work for us, we need to remember that we have a responsibility to God as well. And the way that He wants us to treat everyone that's under us is the way that we hope and pray He will treat us, with fairness and justice. There are also times that we have things recorded for people with bad influence, wrong examples. In Hebrews, the 4th chapter, in verses 1 through 14. The writer here is talking about the things that are waiting for us at the time of rest. The rest that we will be given by God. And there's several things here where we see bad examples that we are encouraged not to follow because it was not appropriate. But when we think about the good things and the one who is over us and the way that we should be conducting ourselves, we want to make sure that our influence is an appropriate influence, a nurturing influence, and we're guiding others to Christ. They look at our example, and the influence that we have on them helps them to realize that there are true Christians in the world. And if we claim to be a Christian and we're not living to the same standard that these true Christians are, we need to make an improvement. There in Hebrews 4:14, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Let us think about the influence of what Christ will do for us and make sure that our influence for others is a reflection of that. The influence that we have on those around us is very, very important. And we need to make sure that we are living in a way that is acceptable to God. And also in a way that is a positive influence to those that we come in contact with every day. Think about the influence that you have had on others in the past. And is there something in that influence that has not been what you really would have wanted it to be? And you need to make a change on that. This morning, if you realize that there is something wrong in your life that you need to get corrected, you need to look at the influence that the Scriptures has for us to get our life back to God and serve Him as we should. If there's anyone here this morning that has a need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to let us know what we can do to help you as together we stand and sing.